Started here. So welcome everybody to All Our Children's June presentation webinar. I'm Lally Lloyd, the director of All Our Children, and welcome to our session. Today we're going to be talking about Advocacy for Education Equity 101. It will be led by Jenkins, who is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for the Expectations Project. In today's interactive session, we'll be looking at what we mean by advocacy and what it looks like for us as Christians to advocate faithfully. We'll learn about some specific models and strategies for organizing ourselves and our churches that can really make a difference for the students and families in our community. All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education justice by supporting congregations and their members and leaders who are exploring and forming and leading community partnerships with under-resourced public schools. And we do this because too many children, most of them living in poverty and many of them children of color, are receiving a substandard education. It's not fair and it's not right. And we also know this is not God's dream. We believe that Jesus showed the church, all of us Christians, how to engage with our communities, how to connect with our neighbors, how to serve our children, and to challenge injustice. To learn more about our growing library of resources, please check out our website at allourchildren.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and our emails, which are always the best way to stay informed about our upcoming programs. Mary Liz Murray, who is All Our Children's Director of Programming and Communications, is going to be monitoring our chat board. So Mary Liz, will you tell folks how that's going to work?
Sure. For those of you who are with us on a desktop or laptop computer or on a mobile device, you should be able to roll over your Zoom screen and get a menu bar to pop up that has some icons in it, which include a chat bubble that says chat. If you click that, it'll open up the chat feature and you'll be able to have discussion with me and our other attendees. To make sure that everybody sees what you're putting in the chat, please make sure to choose all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu of who you're talking to, and that way everybody can be part of the discussion. You can also use the Q&A feature. There's an icon with a big Q. If you would like to send a question directly to me, we will have Q&A at the end that I'll moderate from questions that I get. Or if you're having any technical difficulty, you can send Q&A to me privately and I can see if I can help you troubleshoot.
Great. Thanks, Mary Liz. So we're delighted to have with us Jenkins today. As I said, he's the VP for Policy and Advocacy at the Expectations Project. Aaron and his colleagues at Expectations Project have been good friends and allies to us here at All Our Children for some time now, and we're really delighted to have you with us, Aaron. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here, and hello to everyone joining us electronically. Again, my name is Aaron Jenkins. I want to thank Lally for the invitation and the great staff at All Our Children for gathering us together to have this really important conversation. You know, when we think of this work, you know, I thought about myself. And one of the things that brings me to this work is not only being a son and an uncle of a 3-year-old named Gianni, who is in the education system now. She's in early childhood education program here in Washington, D.C., but also my mom. My mom was the first advocate I saw who advocated not only for my education, but my sister's education to make sure that the public schools that we attended were quality schools and that they met our needs. So the work of the Expectations Project, which I'll get into, is not only my professional work, but it's very personal. If we were together in a room, I would ask you, by a show of hands, how many of you attended public school, how many attended private school, how many were homeschooled, or how many attend parochial school. And based on statistics, we know that for every 10 children in the United States, 9 attend public school. And that number is pretty consistent for years and years. So you think about it, that's millions of children who are in our public school system. So I was one of those children, grew up in Washington, D.C., born and raised. And coming onto the Expectations Project with both a government background and a faith background, I was excited to see those two areas coming together. And I think that when faith communities and members of communities and organizations think of ways to be advocates, it's one of the best work to bring together faith in action. So with that, we're going to get started. We're going to jump right into the material. And I'm excited to do this presentation today. I want to acknowledge my colleague, Zakiya Jackson, who is the creator of this presentation that we are going to go through today. And I'm honored to be your presenter. So with that, we're going to go into Advocacy 101 and what that means. So our first slide is, we're doing this work here at TP and the presentation that Zakiya has organized. There are questions that we want to answer. So for the next 35 to 40 minutes, this is what we're going to discuss. These are the central questions that this presentation seeks to answer. The first is, what is advocacy? That's a word that we say often, but we're going to get into the definition of this word, what it means, examples of advocacy, not only in practical or in everyday life, but also what that looks like from a scriptural or faith-based foundation. The next question is something for us to think about is, why should I care about changing systems? And this is going to tie back into advocacy and the definition of that word and what it means. So again, just thinking about questions that are going to guide our time today. What is advocacy? Why should I care? Why should you care about changing systems? The third question is very important. How are systems changed? And that's something that we're going to explore together, what it means to change systems. The fourth is, what are your advocacy values? And this is going to be important. If you think of work and when it drives you, oftentimes when you think of work, you've probably heard people use the phrase, do your passion. I think that's an important piece. And something else that goes with that is, what are your values? What are the standards or the rules or the ideas that you believe and hold inherently, which drive or propel the work that you do externally? So an internal, external. And an important question too is, what are we allowed to do as people of faith, individuals that represent organizations like I do, or people that represent faith communities, 501c3s, what are we able to do? With that, I look forward. If you have questions throughout the time, I think Mary Liz shared there's a chat function. We're going to reserve time at the end to get into questions. So throughout this presentation, if there's anything that you have a question about, anything that's not answered, there's some patience because it may get answered in the next slide or deck. And if anything comes to mind, feel free to park it there, and we'll make sure with the time we have to address as many things as possible. So with that, let's continue on. This next slide says, why should you believe us? Why should you believe in us? And I want to just tell you a little bit about the Expectations Project. We are an education nonprofit that have a really important mission. And as you can see, it's definitely faith-driven and faith-focused. We are faith leaders using our combined influence to demand a high-quality education for all God's children, regardless of the zip code they live in, the money their parents make, or the color of their skin. This really resonates with me for a number of reasons. One being that as someone who comes from the inner city, who's raised in a single parent household, I lived in a zip code. And when I reflected on this, recognized that, it was the work of advocates. It was the work of people fighting for rules change to make sure young people had opportunities that really had an impact on me. And I'm sure when we examine our own lives, we can see that being the case, that you benefited from work of people that you may have never met, but because they did that work, there's a benefit that you gain. So that's the Expectations Project. We are based in Washington, D.C., and we work with organizations, individuals, and faith communities to achieve this work. We have 5 areas of focus that we as the Expectations Project work on, and they're listed here, but I'm going to go ahead and read them for anyone joining us by phone and not able to access the slides. The first is early child education. And many of these things are self-explanatory, but early child education, we know that children, particularly at the earlier stage of life, they very early on, children are able to learn, but influenced by what information they take in. So you may be familiar with language such as the word gap that exists between children that are exposed to reading and language very early on and those that are not. that's something of importance to us, that preschool and early child education is possible and accessible. The second idea or second policy area of focus for the Expectations Project is trauma-informed schools. And these are schools that have an informed system of care for children that may experience trauma, which could exist both or inside the school or outside of the school. So inside the school, you could experience bullying and things of that nature, which can cause trauma, which can affect children's ability to learn, and trauma that may happen outside of the school, which relate to poverty, income levels, violence in the community, or dangers that students face. And again, when we look at children, we know that those traumas can really influence how they operate. The third is high standards and expectations. These are the standards that schools and educators have for their children and for the young people in school, and the expectations they have. And we know that this is a qualifier in terms of children being able to not only excel and succeed, but their ability to engage, and that this is something that's important. The next is a given, but it's something worth saying, which are quality teachers and leadership. We know that a highly skilled teacher can help a student that is behind in grade levels jump several grades to catch up. And we know that a highly effective teacher can allow a child who's on grade level to exceed expectations. The last is access to quality public schools. And this is very important. The ability for children to have a school, no matter their zip code, that has all of these features. You know, if we were to put an umbrella, access to quality schools would probably be the main piece. And then every other area that we discuss are things that we think should be a part of a quality public school. This is a quote from our founder and president, Nicole Baker Fulgham, who started the Expectations Project several years ago. That no school should be under-resourced, no student should be without quality teachers or caring mentors, and no public school that affect their life should go unexamined in places where there are thriving communities of faith. And this is an important idea not only by our president, but something that we as an organization care about deeply. So the question comes up now is, how bad is it really? When you think of public schools and what are the issues facing public schools, what is the real issue? We're going to get into that a little bit. In front of you now are statistics that really start to paint the picture of what's happening in our school system. You can look at the first set of trends that play out nationally in primary school. Indicators of how well students are doing in 4th and 8th grade are ways in which we follow what's happening with students in the education system. To your left, we see statistics for not low-income students and low-income students. And we see in grade 4, when it comes to reading levels in 4th grade, we have those students that are not low-income performing at the 77th percentile, and students from low-income communities performing at the 46th percentile. We see that when we look at reading scores for the 8th grade, those numbers go up, but we still see a gap to the tune of an 81 percentile for not low-income students in reading and their percentage at the basic level or above basic level. And then for students that are low income at the 57th percentile. As you and I both know, this can play out not only in reading, but the other qualifier for which we do research, which is mathematics. And I know you can see this, but for not low-income students, they score in the 90th percentile at or above basic grade level for mathematics. And then for low-income students, they're in the 60th percentile. And this also happens in 8th grade in mathematics. And this is primary school. And as you know, that's a foundational piece for all of our education, how we do there. Statistics also show that 29% of 8th graders are below basic competency in mathematics. 29%, that's a significant number. And that's not on this statistic or this slide, but it's something that I want us to flag in the research that we've done. And when it comes to reading for that same grade level of 8th graders, it's 24%. So this is a serious issue. And sometimes it takes seeing it visually for us to know. For those that are curious, the source for our statistics come from the National Center for Education Statistics and the Center for Education Policy. When we look at high school, we look at reading levels and math levels for 12th graders. So these are persons that are exiting high school and can either enter the workforce or go to college. We see that for reading grade levels for those that are not low income, students score in a 76th percentile. And for those students that are low income, they score in a 58th percentile. And you can see similar numbers for mathematics. So this is something for us to be aware of that's going to shape our discussion today. In our next slide, we see another set of trends that come from the National Center for Education Statistics. When you look at the percentile for whites and the numbers and percentile of how their education is centered, we see that whites score with scores such as in the almost reaching the 300 level. And then there's a huge gap between that and the next group, minority group that we studied, which are the Hispanic or Latino population. In the 90s, in 1992, from 297 for white population that was tested, goes down to 279 for Latinos or Hispanic children. And then for African-American children, you see it goes down to 273 for the composite score. And then as years go on, in 2005, we see a slight dip for white children, but we see that dip as well for Latino and African-American students. But what's consistent from 1992 to 2013 is that there exists a significant gap in scores, in testing scores for white children, Latino children, and Black children. This next slide talks about the on-ramps, and this comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We thought this important to see, and these are students that have self-selected to identify their perception of where they are for college. We see for 8th graders, when they were surveyed to ask if they were going to college, 95% of 8th graders, which is a healthy number of students, say they are going to college. We see the on-ramp for the next slide is that the number that actually graduate from college, and this is looking at national averages, about 80%. So from 95% of 8th graders, 5 years later, that actually graduate from college is 80%. The percentage that are prepared to succeed in college is 37%. And that's a significant drop off from the 80% that graduate high school to the percentage that's actually able to not only succeed in college, but actually prepare for collegiate studies. When we look at low income students that are prepared to succeed in college, we see another jump of 17%. And this is significant. We at the Expectations Project appreciate research, but know that there's an underpinning of why this is the case. And we'll get into it a bit in our presentation. Something we want you to know and something that we believe is that there is hope. We in this next section will show statistics and numbers that reflect that Christians and people of faith are centered and positioned in a way to not only address this issue, but the reason they're able to address it is the trust that Christians have among vulnerable populations, especially in the church. And we'll look at some of those statistics now. For the percentage of adults who say religion is important to them, we see that racially it starts to break down in a number of ways. For the white population who was tested by the Pew Research and Religious Landscape Study, we see it's about 49% that say religion is very important, 20% somewhat important, and you can see the statistics as they continue. For the African American or Black population, that percentage of persons who say religion is important is 75%. For Latino population, and I jumped to that because it's the population in our last slide that were tested, it's 59%. And you can see for other populations, the Asian population is 36%, the other is 54%. This shows that religious communities really resonate with adults. And these are adults who are parents, they are uncles and aunts, like myself. They are persons of faith who can take action and who can work in these areas. This next slide comes from the United Negro College Fund, and this was a survey specifically of low-income African-American parents. And this survey was done to cite the organizations and individuals that are most influential and trustworthy in supporting them to help their children do well in school and to get prepared for college. Now, some people are surprised by this, but if you think of our last slide, the high percentage of African-American adults who trust their faith communities, or who trust their faith communities, you can see that churches and church programs far and away exceed the amount of trust that our surveyed persons believe at 36%. The next group that low-income African-American parents trust in terms of organizations or individuals that are influential and seeing their children go to college and do well in school are parents. So you can see a significant percentage change that faith communities hold a very important place in this population. And then the next group is parents. The next group after that are teachers. If you think of the amount of time our children spend in school versus the amount of time they spend in faith communities, it can vary from community to community. But overall, children spend a significant amount of time, 13 years of their life from age 5 to 18, a significant number of time with teachers. And you can see that there's a different trust level. If you continue looking at the slide, you can see it goes down for people that they don't trust, the parent-teacher association or organization, school counselors, principals, elected officials. But it's important to note here that faith communities hold a very high percentage of trust for this population that brings together both race and income. We've done research and we found that there are 300,000 congregations in the United States. And if we round this number up, there are about 50,000 public schools that fall into the high poverty category. Statistically, this would mean that for every public school that falls into this category of high poverty, which tends to have large populations of students of color, there could be up to 6 congregations that could surround that school and provide support, encouragement. And again, this resonates because of the amount of trust that low-income communities, and particularly communities of color, have for faith communities. But just think about that for a second, that wherever your house of worship is, and I know that these numbers will change from urban to rural to suburban areas, but on average, we're talking 50,000 high poverty public schools and 300,000 congregations that could come to their aid, that could be helpful, that could be impactful. And that's something worth noting. So an important question next is something that we discuss often. What is advocacy? What does the word mean? How is it defined? Before we get to that, we are going to play a game. I really like this game. It's called Advocacy. Is it advocacy or nah? And nah is a colloquial way of saying no. Is this advocacy or no? So what's going to happen next is that I'm going to show you a series of slides and ask you questions and ask, is the thing that you're looking at, is it advocacy or no, or not? And I want you to think about it for a second. So for each slide, I'm going to pause and ask you to think about it. Keep track of it. If you have paper in front of you, you can write down your answer. If it's yes or no, there'll be a couple of questions. And if it is advocacy, say yes. And if it's not advocacy, you can say no. And if it's, even though this isn't an answer, but some of you like me are middle of the road people, so you may say maybe, so feel free to answer that way. If yes or no does not suit you, but think about it. Is this advocacy or not? The first slide in question is reading with children and after school, advocacy or no? As you're thinking about it, there are churches, there are nonprofit organizations that encourage reading with children. We know that literacy is a huge issue and illiteracy can be a huge problem. So is reading with children after school, is it advocacy in your opinion or no? That's our first question. Going to our next question, is donating supplies to a local school advocacy? Is it advocacy or no? Is it advocacy or not? Yes or no? I attend a church here in the Washington metropolitan area, and we have adopted a school. We in the past adopted schools to provide supplies at the start of the school year, and it was something that is really important to our church to provide. Is donating supplies, whether it's through a faith community or not, to a local school, is it advocacy or not? Think about it. Think about it. All right. The next question. Giving money to a nonprofit organization that supports first-generation college students. Is this advocacy or not? First-generation college students are students who have parents who have not attended or completed college. So they are the first ones to not only attend, but they have the goal of completing college. Is giving money to a nonprofit that supports this work, is it advocacy or not? And the last question, walking with students to school to make sure they arrive safely, is this advocacy or not? I remember my crossing guard. She was about 4'6", 4'7", but she wielded a mean whistle and stop sign. And when I walked to my local elementary school, which is about a 10 to 15-minute walk from my home, I knew that when I got to that very busy intersection, that if she were there, I knew I was going to get across safely. Is walking with students to school, if you were someone to help to get them there safely, is it advocacy or not? Think about it. All right. Here's how the Expectations Project defines advocacy. The strategic and organized actions that have the goal of systemic, scalable change. I'll repeat that. Advocacy, as we define it as an organization, is strategic and organized actions that have a goal of systemic and scalable change. So think about your answers as we go back through them. So can it be advocacy? You know, for each of these topics, we'd have to look at the core issue that creates the outcome that supports the need for what's happening. Reading to students after school, based upon the definition we gave of advocacy, which again is strategic and organized actions that have the goal of systemic, scalable change, reading to students after school would not be considered advocacy. It would be what we call compassionate service. Here is a reaction to a problem of illiteracy. But if we ask ourselves, what is the root issue? The issue is that kids cannot read. So advocacy in this case would be creating a scalable response to addressing students who need to learn to read. How will we get at the root issue? Here in Washington, there's a really high percentage. I think I saw an ad that said for every 20 persons in Washington, D.C., one is illiterate. So with a population of 700,000 people, that is many, many illiterate people. So if we were addressing a systemic issue, our action would have to be scalable to address that. The next one, donating school supplies. Is it advocacy or not? And the answer, if it's donating to your local school, it would be great compassionate service, addressing a problem in the best way we know how. But the root issue is, why aren't the students supplied? Why don't they have the supplies they need? I saw an article recently this week that said teachers spend on average out of pocket $500 for school supplies that they don't have, that they need. And the question that we have to answer as faith communities and as people that seek justice and seek to advocate, right? We'd have to ask the question, why? Why don't teachers have the supplies they need? So advocacy, is this advocacy? It would be no. Donating school supplies to a local school would be compassionate service, but it would not be advocacy, given that working definition. And you can see for the third and fourth question, it's similar. As an organization, we see helping first-generation college students through nonprofit giving as compassionate service. As someone who was the executive director of a nonprofit, every gift mattered. We were addressing a root problem, which is, why aren't first-generation college students receiving the skills and the needs that they have? Why aren't their needs being met? And this nonprofit that's seeking to address it, think about the scale. I know the nonprofit I am on the board of, we reach 30 students a year. But think about the millions of other students that we don't reach. So while it's compassionate service and it's making an impact in the lives of those 30 to 35 students, unless it's scalable to really address the need, we would say that is not advocacy. And the last, walking students to school. That is a big deal, particularly in urban areas, in areas where students are traveling to places that are considered violent. Walking students to school is compassionate service, but based upon that definition, if we were not addressing all students that have that issue, it's not advocacy. So brings us to an important question, is why should I care about changing systems? And this gets into, we're going to look at scriptures. And there are three big things that we've identified as to why this is important. Why should you care, person on this webinar, about changing systems? From a scriptural and faith-based perspective, we think that God loves justice. And what is justice? Fair and reasonable treatment is justice. We think God cares about that. The second thing we care about, after God loving justice from a faith-based perspective, is why should the individual, why should the church, why should the organization, and why should the community care about changing systems? is that Jesus censors the condition of people in the margins, those that are left out, particularly in large systems. We call it the haves and the have-nots. So what about the have-nots? We know about the haves. We know how they live. We're very familiar with them. But what about the have-nots? Jesus cared about those persons. The third thing is that God told us that this work for justice is an example of our faith. And we'll get into that. Our first scripture is Isaiah 61. You're probably familiar with this. Verses 1-4 talk about Jesus, who uses the scripture later in the New Testament to literally stand up in a synagogue and say why he does this work. This scripture reflects that God loves justice. Jesus stands and says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor," and goes on to talk about things that we would see as justice. In Isaiah, in verse 4, God literally calls for renewal of ruined cities and to combat generations of devastation. How are cities renewed? It's when persons continue not only doing work of compassionate service to meet the needs, whether it's feeding the homeless and those that are hungry, whether it's addressing the public education system and things of that nature, meeting the problems that you see in your community. Usually people say that the thing that upsets you the most or stirs you up the most is the thing you should focus on, right? We know that we serve a God that loves justice, that loves fair and reasonable treatment, and seeks that his people are pursuing that.
Aaron, it's
Next scripture. Thank you very much. 2:30. I'll keep moving. Thank you. Because I want to make sure we get to questions. The next scriptures look at justice from a number of different perspectives. If you look at the scriptures that are listed, we see justice and advocacy in a number of different ways. Those familiar with Esther, who was the queen when her people, the Jews, were going to be exterminated by a government official, state-sanctioned oppression, that she sought to use her relational influence as queen to do strategic advocacy, right? A lot of language for a story that we're really familiar with. This wasn't a woman with a pretty face who asked her husband not to do this bad thing. This was strategic advocacy, and she used her relationship to do so. Jesus and the little children, if you know this, are familiar with this biblical story of disciples telling the children not to come to Jesus, Jesus uses his relationship and his influence over the disciples to say, "Let the little children come to me." The Samaritan woman is one of my favorite, which is a woman who touches the hem of Jesus' garment in a crowd. And what Jesus does is he says, "Who touched me?" And what he does is he allows a space for this woman to step in and say, "I'm the one that touched you," and give her testimony. He leveraged his influence to give a space and a platform for her to share. And actually, I've just told the story of the woman with the blood condition. The Samaritan woman was different. The Samaritan woman was the woman at the well who spoke to Jesus. And when she came back with people from the town. The joke is she came back with the entire town. That's called grassroots organizing. She convinced the town to come meet a man that spoke with her in a very direct way. The last is the woman that Jesus protected from stoning. An example that set for us is he asks a very good question. He says, "He who is without sin, whoever does not sin, you should throw the first stone at this woman who's done a crime that at the time of the law required stoning." And what he did was that he did not say, "Don't do this thing." He didn't say, "Don't throw the stone," but he leveled the playing field. He says, "If you've brought this woman to me that has sinned, if you have not sinned, throw a stone," and no one could answer. The last thing is that God calls justice, God calls the work that we're talking about true worship. We're supposed to help those that are wrongly imprisoned. We're supposed to let the oppressed free. There are various scriptures that talk about this. The Amos scripture made famous by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. of practicing justice as a form of worship. One of my favorite scriptures, Micah 6:8. What is it that God requires of you? To love justice, show mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. We are called to be people of justice. So the next question is, how are systems changed? And what do we do to actually change systems? This is something that's really important. It requires not only faith, but it requires action. And we're going to get into what that is. There are 4 steps that we've identified that can really be helpful to addressing the issue of systemic change. The first step is to identify the issue. What is the issue that you care about? What is the issue that requires your attention? Right now, we're talking about public schools. If you think about the 5 policy areas that we shared, what is the issue that you want to address? And we're going to go through all of these in detail. But the next says assemble your team. The third step is to find where power sits. And the fourth step is to influence those holding power. Let's go to the first step, identifying the issue or issue identification. It says, what area of education inequity will you focus on? And again, this is really focused on the people on this webinar. What's the issue? One of the ways to identify the issue is asking the question of what's happening in your local school district. We know that there are, again, a number of public schools. We know that there are 300,000 congregations. There are 50,000 low-income public schools or schools of low income. What's happening in the school district? Here in Washington, we've had issues with attendance rates and graduation rates. So if I was looking at this locally within our school district, I know that seniors graduating from high school have to have not missed 30 days of attendance. And if they've missed more than 30 days, they automatically are not allowed to graduate. And there was a policy shift where this is now being enforced. And now that is a local issue. As a community, what do you feel called to advocate for and with? How do you want to advocate? And again, we share with you our areas of focus: access to quality schools, early childhood education, high standards and expectations, quality teachers and leadership, and trauma-informed schools. These are areas of focus that we have. For you, we'd ask the question, how do we identify the issue? The second step is to assemble your team. Who will you advocate with? Are there people impacted directly with the issue that we're talking about? How are they involved with you and informing you? And how will you organize yourself? How will you organize your team? As an education nonprofit, we specifically work with faith communities to advocate for public schools. So we know that our team tend to be individuals, communities, nonprofits, and faith communities that we organize to address this issue. That's the team that TEP would organize and assemble. The third step, and this is really important, is where does the power sit? Who are the persons that possess the ability to change or make decisions that could affect the outcome that you want to see? And here are the questions we ask. Who is in control? Who makes the decisions about the topic at the very beginning or the issue that you've chosen? What kind of access do you have to who is in control? This actually ties really well into the second step of your team. If I know I'm trying to address issues related to the school system, then here in Washington, I'm looking at the school board. I'm looking at the mayor's office, who has direct control of education. I'm looking at the city council that has an education chair, an education committee that addresses those issues. How would I reach those persons if I really wanted to affect change? And then the fourth step, influencing those in power, those holding power. Decide how to best influence the people in control. Decide which advocacy tactics to use and actually do it. So often this can be really scary to talk about advocacy. And we'll stress that in a little bit as well, but we know that if we want the lives of young people to be changed, that someone has to take action, and why not us? There are different advocacy tactics that we can employ, and I'm happy to walk through them one at a time. One is civic engagement. This is something where you can look at the local structure and do things such as write to a local representative or call a local representative, talk to them about an issue that you care about. This is how you get involved. There are meetings to attend from the school board. And as you identify the issue and you're educated in it, you can attend these meetings where elected officials and people that hold power are so that you can talk to them. Another civic engagement piece or another tactic is community organizing. What does that look like? Well, if the community gets together to say that our engagement is going to write or call a representative, community organizing would be getting people in the community involved, right? So that could be, instead of one church member doing this, this could be the church community. Instead of one church, it could be multiple churches, multiple faith communities. But getting people structured and organized, whether it's a simple action or a complex action. Community organizing is important because you get to spread and address your community in a way that can take action to have systemic change. And that's going back to the piece of advocacy. You know, when we look at the civil rights movement, we can see examples of what this looks like. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panthers on the West Coast, groups that are organizing, community organizing, and tactics that we know today, groups such as Color of Change and things of that nature that engage in this work. The third tactic is faith-rooted organizing. And I think a central question, if we're talking about faith-rooted organizing, when we're thinking of people of faith getting involved. And we talked about earlier why this matters, because there's so much trust by communities. We're really asking the question of what is the lie or the sin involved in the issue that you are facing? What is the issue that we're focusing on, right? From a faith-based perspective, the sin, right? That we have to love justice, and where justice is not being loved and justice is not happening, we have a responsibility to take action, and that we take action. Right now, the Poor People campaign from 50 years ago that Dr. King started is being pushed by the Reverend William Barber and the Reverend Liz Theophil. If you haven't heard about this, this is consistent action for 40 days where people are protesting around the country and really are driven by the fact that poverty, war, and racism are things that need to be addressed. Driven by their faith, they are organized and doing these tactics. And they had something called Moral Mondays in North Carolina, which was a start for this. So this is an example. Groups such as Sojourners and folks and Sojourners Magazine that help to not only inform people of what's happening, but to encourage people to take action. That's an example of faith-rooted organizing. And last is Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals. Saul Alinsky is considered the father of kind of recent community organizing tactics. And he wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. And in 10 chapters or 200 pages, he outlines specific tactics, which tend to get very involved. He is an in-your-face person, was an in-your-face person. And his book really addresses issues that can be considered aggressive. But when you think about where you fall in the advocacy spectrum, whether it's civic engagement, community organizing, faith-rooted organizing, or looking at a book like this for specific tactics, these are things that we can consider.
Erin, I'm going to give you a 5-minute warning.
Thank you very much for that warning. Mm-hmm. So the question becomes now, what are your values? You know, when thinking about advocacy, this is not easy work, you know. It's one thing to have an issue that matters to you, but it's another to ask you to think about getting people together, finding out where to go to meetings or writing a letter. You know, this is work that requires bold action and I dare say bold faith. But we know that the stakes are very high. If there are 50 million children in public school out of the 55 million children total in the country, we know that if people are receiving a poor education, we know that that continues on, that the public has failed in its duty to make sure that young people are taken care of. So your values and our values really drive us and drive the work of seeking justice for children. And this is why we engage in advocacy. TEP has a number of values that we adhere to when it comes to advocacy. Our values include things that are strategic and results oriented. It includes things that are values that are committed to long-term change. We don't just want to see one school get better. We want to see all schools get better. And we know that's a high bar, but any goal that's worth pursuing should exceed your reach. And that's one of the things that we're committed to. Our work is centered around communities of color. We know that these communities, based on the statistics we've shown you, that they are negatively and adversely impacted by this work. So we know that we need to be focused on that group. We want to elevate the voice of those most impacted. When we talk about the margins, and Jesus kind of centers the margins, he didn't come to talk to the Pharisees and Sadducees. He was talking to those persons that were unaffiliated, those that were in the community. We know that we are urgent yet hopeful. We know that this work is daunting and it's huge and exceeds our grasp, but we know that there are 300,000 congregations in this country and 50,000 schools that if we get enough people together, we know that we can make a change. We want to make sure that we embody the third way and that we're collaborative in our work, that we work with multiple communities, that we look at continuous learning and feedback loops, that when we learn lessons and see strategy actions and advocacy action, compassionate service that can be scaled to become advocacy. We know that we want to use that information because we're trying to achieve a big goal, which is making sure that no zip code is a detriment to the school that a child can go to. Our work is nimble and integrated, and it's finally courageous. It takes courage to do this work. What we are allowed to do, we want to let you know that advocacy is something you can do all day if you're a part of a 501c3 organization. You can do it both as a part of a group or as an individual. Policy issues that impact students are important. We know that offering solutions to those policy issues are important too, and that's part of advocacy. Compassionate service can be changed into advocacy. If you work at a local school and you see the impact of reading with a child for 1 hour a day, for every day, 5 days a week, the advocacy action or policy solution could be in schools that have low test scores, low reading. Let's make sure that all public schools, all elementary schools, all junior high schools, all high schools have that level of engagement to change the outcome. So advocacy is something that we can do all day. Lobbying is different. Lobbying, you can only do a little bit of this. And by little bit, we, in doing research, find that it's 20% of your budget expenses. And this is for organizations that are nonprofits. What is lobbying? Lobbying is when you have a specific outcome that you want and you go to places where those in influence, particularly elected officials, you're really trying to change their mind and get them to vote the way you want. Advocacy is different because you want a larger outcome or an outcome for an issue that affects a large number of people. But lobbying is when you want X bill or X thing to be done. For lobbying, you can do as much of this as you want as an individual citizen. But again, there are restrictions if you're a part of an organization. Direct support or opposition of a specific piece of introduced legislation would be the technical definition of lobbying. And there's a difference between the two. So what now? After all of this time together, and thank you for being a great audience, here are things that we want to highlight for you that you can consider when you're thinking about how you can take action. Question to ask yourself is, where are you starting? Pick a place where you want to take action. It can be based on something we shared today, if it resonated with you, if there's work happening in your community, something that you're a part of, if you're a part of compassionate service or volunteering. Start there and start to apply those action steps that we gave. Who are you talking to about this? You can choose someone in your community, you can choose someone in your family, your friend group, on your Facebook feed that you can share this with, and invite people to join you. I ask this question often, what is the best school in your city and what is the worst school? And how can the worst school be the best school? Why can't we have all best schools? Something to think about. How will you keep learning? Feel free to take down our information if you want to talk to us about this work. All Our Children has a number of resources and we are partners with them in this work. But we want you to continue learning, to not only be informed, but to take action that's informed action. And the last thing is, what change am I working towards? This is an important question. What is it in your local community that you want to see changed? Here in our community, we want to see public schools and low-income areas with high concentrated children of color have better outcomes that are increased and that are the best that they can be. With that, I want to close. I want to thank you. The information you see on screen is the contact information for the Vice President of Education and Training, Zakiya Jackson, who is the organizer of this presentation. With that, I turn it over to the ALC staff for questions and discussion.
Great, thanks, Aaron. If you folks have any questions while we wrap up, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I don't think there are any right this second. Aaron, we did have a request that you go back to slide 6 so that folks can see that quote from Nicole.
Oh, sure. Excuse me for scrolling quickly.
And we had a great group. They did pretty well with your quiz questions on our poll.
Okay.
So that's great. Lally, did you have any follow-up questions or anything you think Aaron can add to this conversation before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I think this was a nice introduction. What I love about your approach to this, Aaron, is that it has a very wide understanding of advocacy. And there's so much that we, as members of our faith communities, as members of our neighborhoods, as members of our families and friend groups, that we can actually do that is advocacy, as well as the things that we might think of as being more associated with advocacy in terms of civic engagement and community organizing. So I appreciate the broad scope that you use to describe what advocacy means.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap up here. I'd like to ask everybody on our webinar who is tuned in to take a quick evaluation. I've just put the link in the chat box. It's 4 or 5 questions. It'll take you 3 minutes. We learn something every time we do one of these, and we really want all of your feedback about what worked and what we might do differently next time to make it work better. You can also type in your thoughts in the chat box if you have any feedback you want to give us live right now, but there is a link to our Google form evaluation.
And I want to invite everybody, while you're doing that feedback for us and evaluation, I want to invite you all to mark your calendars for Tuesday, June 26th. We'll be having the next in our webinar series will be a panel discussion, and our topic is Standing on Holy Ground, the spiritual and theological case for education equity. What difference does it make that we do this work as Christians? Aaron gave some wonderful scriptural references that are critical for the building blocks of standing on this ground. But as Christians, how are we doing this work differently than our secular friends and allies? And how can we talk about the work that we're doing in the terms of our Christian faith traditions, both in terms of scripture, in terms of the example of Jesus' life and ministry, and the different theological traditions of our different faith denominations. So I hope everybody can join us then, and tell your friends.
And one of our panelists for that discussion will be Nicole Baker-Fulgham, whose quote we're looking at right now. So if you want to hear more about the Expectations Project and the theological grounding that she personally has in this work, she will be part of that webinar.
Great.
All right. I think that if you have gotten the link to our feedback form and you see the registration link for the June 26th webinar, we are ready to close. So for everyone on the call with us, thank you so much for joining us. Aaron, if you could just hold on while we finish up here, we'll have some questions for you.
Sure.
We thank everybody who joined us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, AOC, for having me. Thank you, Lally. Thank you, Mary Liz. And if you want more information about the Expectations Project, our website is www.expectations.org. www.expectations.org.
Oh, hey, Aaron, I have a quick question for you. I know that sometimes you all do webinars, instructional webinars, and make things available online. What's the best way for the folks who are listening today to stay in touch with what's coming up in your own programming?
Sure, that's a great question, Lali. Thank you for offering it. A few ways. One, we have a great presence on Facebook. If you Google the Expectations Project or search the Expectations Project, you'll find our page. And you'll find our name across social media platforms, the Expectations Project. That's one way and a guaranteed way to be up to date on things that are happening with the organization. Another way, of course, is our website, www.expectations.org. You can learn about our work that in the advocacy community, not only regionally, but also nationally. And the third, of course, is by email. It's the old-fashioned way. On our website, you will see pictures and staff titles for all of us, and also have our email access page so that you can get our email account and reach out to us. So social media, the Expectations Project, our website, expectations.org, and email and contact information on the website for individual staff members in a general email box.
Great.
Thank you.
And if there's interest in learning more about advocacy, we do a number of trainings. Again, Zakiya Jackson is our Vice President of Education and Training, and I believe she shared her email at the last part of the slide, which I'll go to, but it's Zakiya@expectations.org, and that'll be coming up at the end here.